Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Eric Severide in Washington, Steve Rowan in Washington, Dan Rather at the White House, Ike Pappas in Memphis, Bill Plant in Memphis, Peter Burns in Atlanta, John Hart in Cleveland, and Bert Quint in Khe Sanh, South Vietnam.
Good evening. The body of Dr. Martin Luther King was returned to his home in Atlanta today as authorities in Memphis expressed confidence that his slayer soon will be captured. President Johnson appealed nationally for calm, asking all citizens to deny violence its victory. Nevertheless, the murder sent a shock wave of violence rolling through the big cities of America, and the worst trouble was in Washington, virtually on the president's doorstep. Late today, the president declared a state of emergency, and regular Army troops moved into the nation's capital to protect strategic locations from the violence spreading through the city. Steve Rowan reports.
A stiff breeze fanned the flames of more than half a dozen fires set by looters along 7th Street, and the wind quickly dispersed the tear gas used by police in their only attempts to stop the looting. The looters were mostly young Negro men and women, as well as boys down to the age of 6 or 7. They hit the liquor stores first, then went for clothing stores, appliance stores, and other shops. They roamed back and forth across 7th Street, unhindered by the police, cheering as another plate glass window caved in, laughing at each other as they emerged with armloads of loot. There was little talk of Martin Luther King, just an occasional bitter remark from someone, usually someone not involved in the looting, about the white so-and-so who shot the civil rights leader. A few of them were arrested, usually when they ran into the arms of officers with their loot. And as the afternoon wore on, they stripped just about every store along an 8-block stretch of the street, taking more than they could ever use themselves, discarding what didn't fit or wasn't the right color on the sidewalks outside. Half a dozen police cars stood by, and from time to time, a few of the officers would put on their gas masks, take a few canisters of tear gas, and walk up the street, chasing the looters away for a few minutes. But as soon as they passed, the looting continued. From the air, the scene looked unreal, a row of fires in the middle of an otherwise tranquil city. But everyone knows that this city is not tranquil, that a flare-up of violence has been threatening for years. And Mayor Walter Washington moved this afternoon to prevent real violence, real bloodshed, by imposing a curfew on Washington from 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 a.m. This was to have been the weekend for Washington's Cherry Blossom Festival, but all the events of that annual celebration were canceled. A few Negroes complained of police violence, but there was little of it. The officers did take a number of Negroes into police custody, arrested them in the act of looting. As the afternoon wore on, one policeman took off his gas mask, looked around, and asked if the National Guard had been called. "We need them," he said. "We can't hold this tonight. We're losing." And indeed, the city of Washington lost much this afternoon. But the troops were called in late in the day, arriving near the White House, from which point they'll fan out. Steve Rowan, CBS News, Washington.
The violence was by no means limited to Washington. Detroit tonight is under a curfew, and National Guard troops are on duty there. Guardsmen also have been mobilized in Chicago, where 5 blocks of predominantly Negro West Madison Avenue were reported afire, and where looting broke out in the downtown Loop area. And in Boston, where a menacing crowd of young Negroes kept customers trapped in a supermarket for a time. The Guard also is on duty in 3 cities in North Carolina and 2 in Tennessee. Last night or today, racial trouble also broke out in such widespread locations as Denver, Colorado, Oakland, California, and Buffalo, New York. At least 4 persons have been killed in the outbursts, and countless more injured or arrested.
Black & Decker dealers are having a special spring sale. There are irresistible values on jigsaws that cut wood, metal, and plastic. Oh. There are big savings on circular saws that do anything a hand saw can do. Better, faster. Oh, come on. There are special deals on dual-action sanders for finishing and refinishing beautifully. Oh, that's better. The Black & Decker label assures you of the finest power tools made. Spring will be a little great this year. For Cousin Tom, for Uncle Don, for your boss. Men who work with power tools know, for value, performance, and service, you can expect the best from Black & Decker.
The crisis in race relations shoved the Vietnam War into the background at the White House today, and President Johnson devoted almost all his time to the problem. CBS News White House correspondent Dan Rather reports.
The President canceled plans for a Vietnam Strategy Conference in Honolulu. General Westmoreland will be in Washington tomorrow instead. Mr. Johnson requested a joint session of Congress for Monday night to discuss civil justice. He proclaimed Sunday a national day of mourning and prayer. These actions followed in rapid succession a White House meeting this morning. The President and 21 of the nation's best-known civil rights leaders. Dr. King's father was invited but could not attend. He sent word he joined the President in calling for law and order. The assembled civil rights leaders went with the President to a memorial service at National Cathedral. The Cathedral memorial service was packed. The President's mood was somber and serious all day, before, during, and after his appearance at the Cathedral. Back at the White House, Mr. Johnson met again with the civil rights leaders, Chief Justice Warren and House Speaker McCormick included. Negro leaders stated bluntly what they thought should be done: rapid, positive civil rights legislation and spending. The President said bluntly that a continuation of divisiveness and violence would be nothing less than a national catastrophe.
The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together, as never in the past, to let all the forces of divisiveness know that America shall not be ruled by the bullet, but only by the ballot of free and of just men.
Shortly after the President spoke, black smoke from riot fires in downtown Washington drifted over the White House and its half-mast flag. Dan Rather, CBS News, at the White House.
Attorney General Ramsey Clark in Memphis said the murder appears to have been the work of one man and there is no evidence of conspiracy. Without elaboration, he said the investigation has spread several hundred miles beyond Tennessee and authorities are very close to an arrest. The fatal shot came from a boarding house across the street from the hotel balcony where Dr. King was standing alone last night. This photograph was made Wednesday. The landlady described the suspect as a white man who registered as John Willard and who had what she described as a silly smile I'll never forget. For film reports, we go to Ike Pappas and Bill Plant in Memphis and Peter Burns in Atlanta. First, Pappas.
Eyewitnesses to the assassination say that Dr. King left his room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel just before dinner to get some air. He walked over to the railing at this spot, and noticing some friends below, he leaned over and began to speak with them. Police say 205 feet away, in a window in a flophouse, the assassin waited, leaning forward to brace his arms on the window ledge to steady his rifle. And this was his view. He fired a single shot that hit its target squarely, and then he ran. Down the hallway and along the decrepit stairs, turning, he raced out to the street. And as one policeman said, he simply faded.
Just at 8 this morning, Dr. Martin Luther King's body was brought to lie in state for an hour. Hundreds paid their respects during that brief hour. They were old. They were dressed for work. They were almost all black. And for some of them, the experience was just too much. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's closest friend in life.
Even forevermore. I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. I am the resurrection and the life, saith the Lord. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.
The plane had come from Atlanta bearing Mrs. King. There were police and National Guardsmen at the airport with rifles and shotguns and riot sticks to hold back the crowd of newsmen and spectators. After some delay, the casket was placed aboard for the last journey home to Atlanta. And late today, a judge in Memphis approved the march which Martin Luther King had planned to lead next Monday. Bill Plant, CBS News, Memphis.
Militants and non-militants stood quietly as Dr. King's wife and 4 children left the plane for a limousine. The rains had stopped just before the plane arrived. Mayor Allen led the motorcade from the airport through downtown Atlanta to a funeral home just a few blocks from the gold-domed state capitol, and another crowd of 500 waited there. Mrs. King took the children into the home. She met with friends and family to make plans for the funeral. His brother, Reverend A.D. King, came here from Louisville. The acting president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, spoke to the people.
He was a man that did not believe in violence.
Amen.
He believed in nonviolence.
Yes, sir.
He lived this, he preached this, and this is the way he died.
Family sources indicate that funeral services will probably be held on Tuesday in Dr. King's father's church here. Peter Burns, CBS News, Atlanta.
With the death of Dr. King, his longtime aide and close friend, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, becomes head of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Abernathy pledged today to continue to follow the nonviolent philosophy that dominated Dr. King's civil rights activity.
Yum, yum, yum. Cool Whip. It's new, the first modern topping with that good old-fashioned taste. Comes whipped in its own little bowl. It keeps in the refrigerator, ready to serve. All whipped. Has lots less calories than whipped cream you make. New from Birdseye. Cool Whip. Try it.
It's the first modern topping with that good old-fashioned taste.
Chris Gaynor is never going to be fat. Fat is the end of roses and phone calls and the groovy world of 4 a.m. Fat is the end of life. That's why Chris watches the scales and eats Deserta for dessert. 9 calories, sweetened without sugar. Wonderful Deserta gelatin, made by the Jell-O people for people who love dessert but can't stand the calories. Skip dessert? Ridiculous. Just make dessert Deserta.
Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy issued an especially poignant statement saying, "I weep for Mrs. King and for her children for this senseless act of hate." And she prayed that the price Dr. King paid, quote, will make room in people's hearts for love, not hate. In Cleveland, her brother-in-law, Senator Robert Kennedy, also spoke with a special sense of loss. John Hart reports.
There was no campaign today, but Senator Kennedy, who had publicly remembered his brother was killed by a white man, wanted to talk about what he said were the terrible truths of our existence. At the Cleveland City Club, Mrs. Kennedy was with him as he spoke of a mindless menace of violence.
Some look for scapegoats. Others look for conspiracies. But this much is clear. Violence breeds violence, Repression breeds retaliation, and only a cleansing of our whole society can remove this sickness from our souls.
Earlier, thousands of people gathered outside and in the Old Stone Church of Cleveland for a memorial prayer service. Mayor Carl Stokes asked for a continuing.
You can kill a man, but you cannot kill an idea. And the idea and the ideals for which Dr. Martin Luther King stood, for which he lived, and for which he died, will continue to live in this country, will continue to live in this city. And despite the sorrow under which all of us today feel so heavy, there will on the morrow be a resurgence of the confidence that he was right and that we will overcome.
World reaction was a mixture of sorrow, regret, and concern over what might happen next. Condolences came from presidents, kings, and other heads of state. Pope Paul appealed for calm and said he was profoundly grieved. Britain's parliament expressed horror at what it called this brutal and senseless murder. The Soviet newspaper Izvestia condemned America as a country of violence and racism. Black Power advocate Stokely Carmichael, who was very much in evidence last night when trouble started in Washington, today called upon Negroes to avenge Dr. King's death. We have to retaliate, he told a news conference, and the place for that retribution will be in the streets. The House Rules Committee postponed action on the Senate-passed Civil Rights Bill today after failing to muster a quorum. 20 House Republicans have urged immediate enactment of the bill, bottled up in committee in an argument over whether a compromise should be sought on the measure's strong open housing provision. Longshoremen closed down Atlantic, Great Lakes, and Gulf ports today as a one-day tribute to Dr. King. In a similar move, the National Maritime Union urged its 55,000 member seamen to stay off the job until tomorrow afternoon. The AFL-CIO plans to send a delegation Monday to march in Memphis and another to Dr. King's funeral.
Remember? Remember when smoking a reduced tar and nicotine cigarette made you feel all alone in the world? Well, not today. Things have changed. You're not alone anymore. Today, more and more people smoke true filter cigarettes because true satisfies. Satisfies with good taste and reduced tar and nicotine. True filter cigarettes with the air filtration system, the good feel of a built-in mouthpiece, the good taste, and reduced tar and nicotine, with or without menthol. Shouldn't your brand be true?
A strongly worded statement by North Vietnam today may complicate current efforts to arrange talks between Hanoi and Washington. CBS News correspondent Charles Collingwood, reporting from Hanoi, says the official government newspaper has called the partial bombing halt insufficient. The North Vietnamese, he said, now appear to be again demanding an end to all air and naval attacks against the North as evidence that Washington really is interested in negotiations. Earlier this week, you'll recall, Hanoi said it would be willing to talk about a complete halt to the bombing. That position was endorsed by the Soviet Union today, but Red China denounced the new round of peace efforts as just another American hoax arranged with Russia's cooperation. Peking said there was only one course for the Vietnamese communists: go on fighting. South Vietnam's President Thieu said today he does not think Hanoi is really serious about peace talks, but he said if there are genuine negotiations, his government, and not the United States, will have to play the principal role. Saigon observers said Thieu's remarks underlined his regime's concern that any talks might set off a succession of peace moves that would end with U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. In the war, a 20,000-man Allied relief force took more of the pressure off Khe Sanh today by occupying some of the high ground around the Marine outpost. The Allied column met little resistance in moving within a mile of Khe Sanh. But without giving any reason, their commanders made no immediate attempt to link up with the Marines inside. During the day, a contingent of Khe Sanh Marines beat back a communist attack on Hill 471, which was taken from the enemy yesterday. In the latest action, 74 North Vietnamese and 7 Americans were reported killed. CBS News correspondent Bert Quint was at Khe Sanh when the Marines started out for Hill 471, and here is his report.
Some of Khe Sanh's Marines are beginning to leave their positions, but it's not the retreat that was feared for so long. For the first time since the siege began on January 21st, the Marines are going on the offensive. It's not very much of an offensive yet, but it is the beginning of the participation of this barren outpost in Operation Pegasus, which is meant to take the pressure off of the men dug in here. It is starting with the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines, 1,200 of the 6,000 men at Khe Sanh. They have been clinging to the southeastern slope of Khe Sanh, and like their buddies all over the plateau, have been taking a murderous pounding day after day, night after night, and have been able to do little about it except hide in their bunkers. Now they've been chosen to make the first offensive move off of Khe Sanh since the North Vietnamese came into the area in force. Major Donnelly, your men will be moving out soon. Where are you off to?
We're off to Hill 471, just to the south of us here, a ridgeline that runs as an extension of this hill we're on.
What is the object?
The objective is to take and hold the high ground around Hill 471 and destroy the enemy as we go down there.
Is this to give cover to the Army troops that are coming this way?
We haven't really been told this, but it might fit in what little I have heard about the big plan.
The fact that the Marines are beginning to venture out does not mean that the siege of Khe Sanh is over. The enemy is still out there. The pace has slowed, but there still is a lot of firing going on. Over the last few days, most of it has been outgoing, but it's not all that way. Last week, about 500 rounds came in every day to Khe Sanh and a few of the surrounding hills held by the Marines. There's no question about it. The North Vietnamese are still out there. How many of them are left and whether or not they'll choose to stand and fight, it's impossible to say. But if they do decide to make a fight of it, then Khe Sanh's defenders won't be able to breathe easily for quite a while yet. Bert Quint, CBS News, at Khe Sanh.
The United States today formally gave back to Japan Iwo Jima and other islands in the Bonin group that were captured from the Japanese in World War II. The transfer was the outgrowth of an agreement reached in talks last year between President Johnson and Prime Minister Sato. The Japanese still are pressing for the return of Okinawa, site of a big U.S. Strategic Air Command base. Prices declined on the New York Stock Exchange in apparent apprehension over racial violence and the unsettled Vietnam situation. Volume was 12,600,000 shares. The exchange index lost 27 cents.
Here's a Purina dog chow vitamin, and here's a Purina dog chow mineral, and here's one for making tails grow and for a big bark. And here's some for all the rest of you. And it got all the things you need but love. I wonder why they keep leaving out the love.
For you who hold the cat tenderly, Purina announces 7 new variety meals, numbered on the outside, appetizing on the inside. Breathe easy. Aromas so pleasant you'll thank goodness for Purina quality.
tastes so tempting, your cat will thank Purina for goodness. A complete week's variety menu. New from Purina.
Now to Washington and Eric Sevareid for some thoughts on the lessons and legacy of Martin Luther King's life and death. Eric?
We have all been told that we live in a bland and cautious time and are bereft of heroes. We have been told that our generation is as embarrassed in the presence of the noble as our ancestors were embarrassed in the presence of the base. The life of Martin Luther King denies the first assumption. The reaction to his death denies the second. Almost surely, he was the most important American of his time, white or black. He, more than any other man, wielded the cutting edge of history for this time and place. He preached love, so hate, of course, destroyed him, as it destroyed 2,000 years ago the man whose gospel he followed, as it destroyed 20 years ago in India the man whose strategies he adopted. Saints are usually killed by their own people. Dr. King was not. He was not an American Negro. He was a Negro American. As Dr. Abernathy once said of King, he seeks to save the nation and its soul, not just the Negro. King grasped the white man by his shoulder, forced him to turn around, and looked long and hard upon his fellow black American. To some, the sight was frightening. To many others, the landscape of our lives looked richer and full of much greater promise. There are those who proclaim that white society killed Dr. King. Democracy cannot function under such a theory. To blame everyone is to blame no one. Only the Hitlers of this world and their spiritual kin, like young Mr. Carmichael, believe in mass guilt and in genocide as justice. There are those who proclaim that this is a sick society. It is a society containing many sick individuals, white and black, including the moral invalid who fired the shot last night. It is doubtful if this nation has ever before gone into officially proclaimed mourning, its flags everywhere at half-staff, over the death of a private citizen, and this man was a descendant of slaves. This is not the reaction of a sick society, but of a fundamentally healthy society trying desperately to cleanse itself of the one chronic, persistent poison in its body. So the label on his life must not be a long day's journey into night. It must be a long night's journey into day. Walter.
CBS News will present a special half-hour report, Assassination and Aftermath, later tonight over many of these stations. And that's the way it is. Friday, April 5th, 1968. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
Will you see that stalled car in time? You did, because a sheet of Reynolds wrap reflected your headlights. Reynolds wrap introduces new ideas for men. For golfers, Reynolds wrap keeps clubs clean and shiny. For do-it-yourselfers, Reynolds wrap insulates that extra room. For barbecuers, Reynolds wrap lines your grill, spreads heat evenly, makes cleanup easy. For weekend gardeners, Reynolds wrap protects young plants and trees. For dozens of other time, work, and money-saving Reynolds wrap ideas, get this free booklet, Bright Ideas with Reynolds Wrap. Yours free, right inside the roll, when you buy specially marked packages of economy and giant-size Reynolds Wrap. Oven-tempered for flexible strength. Reynolds Wrap. Wouldn't you hate to be without it?
Direct from our newsroom in New York, in color, this has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Will medical science conquer heart disease by the 21st century? Join Walter Cronkite as the 21st century examines the human heart, Sunday on CBS. Attention all.